Rain poured over the crowded downtown sidewalk as everyone rushed past the woman in the wheelchair. She sat motionless near the corner of Fifth and Madison, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered toward the wet pavement, as a river of shoulders and briefcases and indifferent footsteps flowed around her, like water around a stone. She was not blocking anyone. She was simply there, existing in a to make room for. After a long moment, she looked up, and what she saw in the faces of the people around her, the sighs, the quick glances away, the small but unmistakable expressions of impatience, made her chin drop again. She pressed her lips together and whispered something so quietly that only the rain seemed to hear it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm in a wheelchair. I know I'm slowing everyone down." Most of the people who heard it kept walking. A few glanced back with something that might have been sympathy, but none of them stopped. And then one man did. He was tall, broad-shouldered, carrying nothing but a worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. He wore a well-fitted suit that had clearly been tailored for his frame, but there was nothing flashy about him, no watch that announced itself, no shoes that demanded attention. He had the kind of stillness about him that made people feel, without quite knowing why, that everything was going to be fine. He stopped when he heard her words, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not discomfort, something quieter and more deliberate than either of those things. He set down his backpack, took a slow breath, and turned toward the woman in the wheelchair. He did not pull out his phone. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. He simply knelt beside her, right there on the wet sidewalk in his good suit, and made one quiet decision that would set everything else in motion. Within 48 hours, their story would travel across the country in ways neither of them could have predicted, because that single act of kindness, unremarkable as it seemed in the moment, had uncovered a truth about both of them that neither had ever expected to find. His name was Marcus Johnson, and he was 39 years old. To most people who passed him on the street, he looked like a well-dressed professional on his way to a meeting, the kind of man you might hold a door for without thinking twice, or nod to in an elevator and forget by the time you reached your floor. To the small circle of people who actually knew him, he was something considerably more complicated than that. Marcus had grown up in a neighborhood where the streetlights worked only half the time, and the sound of sirens was as unremarkable as birdsong. He had been raised by a woman named Dorothy Johnson, who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry for 22 years, and who read to Marcus every night before bed, even on the nights when her hands were cracked and raw from the chemicals, and her feet ached so badly she could barely walk. Dorothy Johnson had a saying that she repeated so many times throughout Marcus's childhood that it had become less a sentence and more a rhythm, something his heart beat to without his even noticing. Never measure a person by what they can do for you. Measure them by what kind of world they carry inside themselves. Marcus was 6 years old the first time he heard it. He was 34 when his mother died of cancer, and he was holding her hand, and those words were the last thing she ever said to him. He had built his career on the belief that design could either dignify or diminish, that the way a building welcomed or excluded people said everything about the values of the person who conceived it. He had studied architecture on a full scholarship, worked his way through graduate school, and eventually founded a firm that bore his name quietly on a small brass plate outside a modest office building in Midtown. The firm had designed hospitals and community centers and schools and transit stations across 7 states. It had won national awards that Marcus accepted on behalf of his team and then returned to the office and forgot about. He drove a practical car. He ate lunch at the same sandwich counter near his office 3 days a week. He wore good suits because Dorothy had always told him that looking like you respect yourself costs nothing compared to the alternative. Nobody outside of his professional world knew that his company was valued at several $100 million. He never mentioned it. It had never felt like the most interesting thing about him. Emily Carter was 35 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years learning how to apologize for being alive. She had not always been this way. Once in a life that sometimes felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely, she had been the kind of woman who walked into a room and filled it. She had studied piano from the age of 4, performed her first recital at 7, and by the time she was 22, she had played in concert halls from Chicago to Boston to Vienna. She had the kind of talent that made other musicians stop mid-conversation to listen, a warmth and precision in her playing that went beyond technique into something that felt almost like confession. She had been happy. She had been planning a wedding. She had been, by any reasonable measure, exactly where she wanted to be in the world. The accident happened on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks before her scheduled performance at Carnegie Hall. A driver ran a red light on a slick street, and in the space of 4 seconds, everything changed. Emily woke up in a hospital room with her mother holding her hand, and the doctor's words arriving like stones dropped into still water. Spinal cord injury, incomplete, permanent limitations, wheelchair dependent. She had lain there for a long time after the doctor left, looking at the ceiling, not crying, not speaking, simply trying to understand how the world had become a place she no longer recognized. The wedding was canceled. Her fiancé, a man named Derek, whom she had loved for 3 years and trusted entirely, sat beside her bed one afternoon, about 2 months after the accident, and told her, in a voice that was gentle and terrible in equal measure, that he was sorry, but he could not spend the rest of his life pushing a wheelchair. He left the same evening. Most of her close friends, people she had known since conservatory, quietly receded over the following months, not out of cruelty, she had eventually come to understand, but out of the particular kind of helplessness that makes people retreat from pain they cannot fix. Her performing career was over. The concert hall that had once felt like home became a place she drove past without looking. What remained, after all of that, was a woman who had learned to make herself small. Emily worked part-time doing remote transcription, and occasionally taught piano lessons online to children whose parents did not know, because she never mentioned it, that their teacher had once performed in Vienna. She lived in a small, accessible apartment 12 blocks from where Marcus first saw her, and she navigated the city with a kind of practiced invisibility, moving through crowds and transit systems and restaurant doorways, in a way designed to cause as little friction as possible. She had become, over 4 years, fluent in the language of apology, sorry for taking up space, sorry for moving slowly, sorry for the extra moment it took to board a bus, sorry for the inconvenience of her own presence. She was not bitter. She was simply exhausted, in a way that had stopped registering as exhaustion and had become instead the base note of every day. The bus stop on Fifth Avenue was crowded that rainy Wednesday morning, and Emily had been waiting for 12 minutes. She had timed herself against the shelter's display board and watched 2 buses pass the first one too full to lower the ramp properly, the second one, whose driver had seen her and simply pulled away before she could reach the door. She had told herself, as she always did, that it was fine, that the next one would be better, that she should not take it personally. She was whispering another apology to no one in particular when Marcus walked past. He heard sorry and wheelchair, and he stopped. That was all it took, 2 words and a tone of voice that he recognized immediately, not because he had heard it before from Emily specifically, but because he had heard it in his mother's voice on the bad days, the tired days, the days when Dorothy Johnson would apologize to a cashier for taking too long to count her change, and Marcus, 6 years old and furious on her behalf, would want to say something and not know the words yet. He knew them now. He turned around and walked back to where Emily sat, and he crouched down beside her so that his eyes were level with hers, a deliberate choice, though he did not announce it as such, and he said, quietly and without any particular drama, "You never have to apologize for existing." Emily blinked. She did not know what to say to that. In 4 years, no stranger had said anything to her that was not either pity or inconvenience, and this was neither. Marcus was already standing, already moving around to the back of her chair, already asking, not telling, asking, "May I help you get on?" She said yes before she had thought about it. He maneuvered her chair to the front of the bus door with the calm efficiency of someone who had done it many times, and when the ramp lowered and she rolled aboard, he followed without making any particular production of the fact that he was choosing to ride a city bus in a good suit in the rain. He found a spot near her and said nothing for a moment, just looked out the window at the wet street. Then, as if they were already in the middle of a conversation, he said, "There's a coffee place 2 stops from here that actually has decent espresso and a door wide enough for your chair. You ever been?" Emily looked at him. "No," she said. He nodded. "It's worth it," he said. And that was how it began. The friendship that developed between Marcus Johnson and Emily Carter over the following weeks was the kind that appears, from the outside, to have sprung up quickly, but is, in fact, the product of a very specific kind of recognition. The sense that a person sees you not as a category, but as a particular individual, irreplaceable and specific. Marcus brought coffee and asked her about music. Not about what had happened to her, not about her accident, not about what her daily life required about music, about which composers she thought were underrated, about whether she believed live performance could ever be replaced by recording, about the piece she had been practicing the week before everything changed. He listened to her answers with genuine attention, the way her best teachers once had, and he responded with opinions of his own that were sometimes wrong but always considered. Emily found herself talking for longer than she had intended, about things she had not talked about in years, and she noticed one afternoon that she had not apologized once during the entire conversation. She noticed other things, too. She noticed that Marcus never positioned himself above her. He had a habit of leaning against a low wall or sitting on a bench when they talked, keeping their eye lines matched without making a point of it, as though the geometry of a conversation had meaning beyond convenience. She noticed that when they moved through a space together, he navigated the physical environment with a quiet, competent attention, holding doors without ceremony, choosing routes that worked for her chair without announcing that he was doing so, noticing obstacles before she did, and eliminating them without comment. It was the kind of spatial awareness that did not announce itself, that never required acknowledgement, that functioned like good architecture, invisible until you tried to imagine the space without it. She noticed, too, the small things that had nothing to do with her chair, that he always held his coffee with both hands when he was listening carefully, that he laughed at his own stories only after he had checked to make sure she found them funny first, that he had a habit of going still when something moved him, the way certain musicians go still, at the moment of a phrase they did not expect to affect them. She noticed that he never looked at her the way most people did, with that specific quality of pity that she had come to recognize the way some people recognize the smell of rain before it arrives. He looked at her the way her friends had looked at her before, in the old life as a person who was interesting and worth paying attention to, and occasionally worth disagreeing with. It was during their fourth coffee meeting that Emily told him about Derek. She had not planned to. She had been talking about something else entirely, about how strange it was to listen to music she had once performed and feel the muscle memory of it still living in her hands, and something in the way Marcus was listening had made the rest of it come out: the engagement, the accident, the hospital room. The afternoon Derek had sat beside her bed and said the words she had never quite managed to repeat aloud to anyone since. She said them now. "He told me he couldn't spend his whole life pushing a wheelchair." She said it steadily. "The way you say something you have rehearsed so many times it has worn smooth." Marcus did not move. He sat with what she had said for a long moment, the way someone sits with music after it has ended. Then he said, "They walked away because they couldn't see your worth. That's not a statement about you. It's a statement about everything they were missing." Emily looked at him. She did not cry. But something shifted in her, some small interior weight that had been pressing for 4 years, and for a moment she could breathe more easily. What Emily did not know and would not know for some time was that Marcus carried his own version of a long road behind him. The neighborhood where he had grown up, the East Side blocks where Dorothy Johnson had raised him alone, had been the kind of place where the easiest paths led away from anything resembling the future he eventually built. He had watched friends disappear into systems that had been designed, it seemed, to make disappearance easy. He had been pulled toward those systems himself more than once, and what had pulled him back each time was his mother's voice, not pleading but certain, telling him what she knew him to be. He had gotten a scholarship through a program that found students in underfunded schools who showed particular aptitude, and he had arrived at his university orientation with one bag of clothes, a borrowed laptop, and the absolute conviction that he would not waste the thing Dorothy Johnson had given him. He had not wasted it. He had worked harder than most people understand is possible, and he had built something real and lasting, and he had done it without ever losing the texture of where he came from, without ever becoming the kind of man who forgot that value and visibility were not the same thing. He did not tell Emily any of this for a while. He didn't tell her because it didn't feel relevant yet, and because Marcus had a lifelong habit of letting things arrive in their own time. He had spent too many years watching people change the register of their voice the moment they learned certain things about him. The company, the valuation, the scope of what he had built to be in any hurry to offer that information to someone whose regard he actually valued. What he and Emily had built together was grounded in something more fundamental than his professional biography, and he wanted to be sure the foundation was strong enough before he added the full weight of everything else. He told her gradually, over the weeks, the way you tell someone about yourself when you trust them in pieces, in context, woven into larger conversations about other things, offered when the moment called for it, rather than when it might impress. He told her about Dorothy one evening over dinner, about the reading before bed and the cracked hands and the saying that had become the rhythm of his life. Emily listened the way she listened to music, with her whole body slightly still, her coffee untouched, her eyes on his face with the quality of attention that makes a person feel genuinely understood rather than merely catalogued. Afterward, she said, "She sounds like someone I would have wanted to know." Marcus smiled. "You would have loved each other," he said. "She would have made you play something and then cried about it for a week." The night at the restaurant arrived on a Friday in early spring, when the city had just begun to remember that warmth existed. Marcus had suggested a place, a well-regarded restaurant downtown, that Emily had walked past, in a previous life, many times and never entered. She had dressed carefully for it, more carefully than she had dressed for anything in years, and she felt something adjacent to nervous and adjacent to hopeful when they arrived, which was a combination she had nearly forgotten. The host at the front was polished and efficient, and looked at Emily's wheelchair with an expression that he managed to keep from becoming a grimace by perhaps half an inch. He told Marcus, in a voice that was pitched to suggest apology without offering any real accommodation, that the table he had reserved might present a few challenges, that the dining room had a particular layout, that the flow of traffic between tables was something to consider, and that perhaps there was a more suitable arrangement. He paused here, glancing toward a table near the kitchen, set slightly apart from the main room, tucked behind a partition that might work better for their needs. Emily felt the heat rise to her face. She had felt this heat before. She began to say that it was fine, that they could try the other table, that she did not want to cause any inconvenience. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, pleasantly and without raising his voice, "I'm sorry, would you mind repeating what you just said?" The host blinked. Several people at nearby tables had turned to look. The host repeated himself, slightly less fluently the second time, and in the act of repetition, the meaning of what he had said became somewhat harder to mistake. Marcus nodded slowly. He said, "Thank you." He looked at Emily. "We're staying," he said. Not loudly, not aggressively, simply as a statement of fact. "The way you say the sky is blue." Emily looked at him. He put his hand very lightly over hers on the arm of her chair, just for a moment, and then moved to pull out the chair at their reserved table so that she could wheel in beside it. They sat. The host retreated. A long silence followed, during which the restaurant did its best to pretend that nothing had happened, and Marcus studied the menu with apparent serenity. What happened next happened quickly. The owner of the restaurant, a man named Gerald Park, who had been in the kitchen reviewing the evening's prep, was brought word by a junior manager that there had been a situation at the host stand involving a guest. Gerald came out of the kitchen, expecting to manage a minor complaint. Instead, he walked into the main dining room, looked toward the table in question, and stopped walking. He knew Marcus Johnson. He knew him not as a famous public figure. Marcus was not famous in the ordinary sense, but as the principal investor behind the renovation and expansion project that had, over the past 18 months, transformed Gerald's three-location restaurant group from a struggling collection of undercapitalized dining rooms into something viable and growing. Gerald walked to the table and said, quietly, that he was deeply sorry for what had happened. Marcus accepted the apology graciously and without any particular drama, which somehow made it more significant than if he had made a scene. Then Marcus said, in the same pleasant, unhurried tone he used for everything, "I'd like to talk, when you have a moment, about a few changes I'd like to see made not just tonight, but as a permanent matter of policy." Gerald said, "Of course," whatever Marcus needed, completely. Over the following week, Marcus worked with Gerald's management team to redesign the physical entry and seating of all 3 restaurant locations to proper ramped entrances at the main doors, tables at varying heights with adequate clearance, staff training on how to speak to and about guests with disabilities without reducing them to their disability. He did not fire the host who had directed them toward the back table. He required instead that the man participate in the training, and he required it in a way that framed the training not as a punishment, but as an education, which was a distinction Marcus made carefully, because he believed that most unkindness was not malice, but ignorance, and that ignorance, unlike malice, could be changed. Emily sat beside him during one of the planning meetings and watched him work, watched the way he listened and redirected and held to a clear standard without humiliating anyone in the process, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as respect. Not the admiring kind, the kind that comes from seeing someone do something genuinely hard with genuine grace. "You do this all the time," she said afterward, when they were outside on the street. And she meant it as a statement, but it came out as a question. Marcus looked at her. "Not always this particular version of it," he said, "but something like it. My mother always said the world has exactly as many accessible doors as people decide to build." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I want to help," she said, "not because of my chair, because I know what it feels like to try to navigate a city that was designed without you in mind, and I know what questions to ask that nobody else is asking." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. The project that grew from that conversation was unlike anything Emily had participated in since her accident. Marcus brought her in as a consultant formally, with a contract at a real rate, not as a favor and not as a courtesy, on a set of public design projects that his firm had been commissioned to undertake for the city. A park renovation in the East District, a small outdoor amphitheater, a community library branch, a neighborhood coffee kiosk program. He introduced her to his team not as someone with lived experience of disability, which was the framing she had learned to expect and had learned to find subtly diminishing, but as a design consultant whose expertise in accessibility and user experience was specific, hard-won, and not otherwise available to them. His team received her accordingly. Emily's contribution was specific and concrete and irreplaceable. She knew, from daily experience, every place where an accessible design looked correct on paper and failed in practice. She knew which surface materials were smooth enough in theory, but became treacherous in rain. She knew how sightlines worked, from the height of a seated position, which had implications for stage design that no standing person had thought to consider. She knew which signage heights were technically within guidelines, but placed where a seated person could not read them without craning backward. She knew which public restrooms were technically compliant with accessibility codes and which were, in practice, unusable without assistance. She compiled notes that were precise and detailed, and sometimes funny in a dry, resigned way, observations that managed to be both completely practical and quietly devastating about the gap between the world as designed and the world as actually experienced. And Marcus's team read them with the focused attention of people encountering information that was both important and completely new to them. For Emily, the work was not simply useful. It was restorative in a way that she had not anticipated and could not have fully explained. She had spent 4 years feeling that her knowledge of the world was limited by her chair, that the things she could contribute had been narrowed along with her mobility, that the person she had been before the accident, capable, specific, necessary in the room she entered, had been reduced by circumstance into someone whose primary relationship with the world was one of accommodation and apology. What she discovered through this work was that her knowledge was not narrowed, but deepened, that she understood certain things about human experience in space and dignity and access, that people who had never needed to fight for those things simply did not know and could not be taught in a classroom. She had acquired, over 4 years of navigating a city not designed for her, an expertise as particular and hard-earned as any she had ever developed at the piano, and it was expertise that the world needed, even if the world had not known to ask for it until now. She found herself in conference rooms where designers and engineers and city planners listened to her with the focused attention that musicians give to a teacher who knows something they need to learn, not performing respect, but genuinely taking notes, genuinely revising, genuinely grateful for the correction. She found herself useful in a way that had nothing to do with being brave or inspiring or remarkable for doing something despite a wheelchair. She was simply good at something that mattered, and the work knew it, and the work kept asking her back. She was also, she began to realize, falling in love with Marcus Johnson. She was not sure when it had started, perhaps at the bus stop, perhaps over the first coffee, perhaps in the restaurant when he had said, "We're staying," in that quiet, certain voice. She was aware of the feeling before she had words for it, the way you become aware of a piece of music before you can name it, something warm and frightening in equal measure. She found herself noticing small things about him, with an attention that went beyond friendship. The way he frowned at a problem and went quiet while he thought it through. The particular slowness of his smile when something genuinely pleased him. The care he brought to everything he said. Not the carefulness of someone managing an image, but the care of someone who understood that words, like architecture, had consequences, and chose them accordingly. She did not say anything about it for a long time, in part because she was not sure how to say it, and in part because she had built, over 4 years of loss, a very careful wall between herself and hope. She had built it brick by brick, apology by apology, and she was not sure she knew how to take it down without the whole structure collapsing in a way she could not manage. She was afraid of what it would mean to dismantle it, and she was more afraid still of what it would mean not to. Marcus was not unaware of what was happening between them. He was also not in a particular hurry. He had learned, from Dorothy, and from the years of building things slowly and carefully, that the most important structures were the ones you did not rush, that the speed of completion was not the measure of quality, and that a foundation laid too quickly was the first thing to go when the ground shifted. He had seen enough of the world to know that the feelings growing between them were real and not transient, that they were the product not of circumstance but of character, of the particular kind of recognition that happens when two people see each other clearly and do not look away. He had also seen enough of Emily, specifically her wariness, the precision with which she managed her own expectations, the way she held herself slightly at a distance from good things, as though she had been burned enough times that she no longer fully trusted warmth to understand that the most useful thing he could do was simply stay, not press, not pursue, not make declarations that would put her in the position of having to respond before she was ready. He let the friendship be what it was, trusted it to become what it was becoming, and tried to be present for Emily in the way that Dorothy had always been present for him, not by solving everything, but by refusing to leave, which had always been, in his experience, the thing that mattered most. The outdoor concert happened on a warm evening in early June, in a park that Marcus's firm had been involved in redesigning and that now had, among its other features, accessible pathways and performance sightlines engineered partly from Emily's notes. A local orchestra was performing a program that included works Emily had played in her previous performing life, and she had been quiet for most of the evening, listening with an expression that Marcus could not entirely read. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and the light softened into the long horizontal gold of a June evening, Emily sat for a while without speaking. Then she said, not looking at him, "I kept saying sorry because I thought I was a burden. Every time I apologized, I was really trying to make it easier for people to leave. Like if I acknowledged it, first acknowledged that I was difficult, that I was inconvenient, maybe they'd stay anyway." Marcus listened. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were never the burden. The world just forgot how to make room." He said it simply, without any particular emphasis, the way he said most things, and Emily turned to look at him and found that his expression was entirely serious and entirely kind, and entirely free of the performance that so often accompanied kindness in her experience. She felt her eyes fill. She pressed her lips together and looked back at the park, at the last of the crowd moving toward the exits, at the lanterns strung through the trees that the renovation had kept, and the new plantings that had replaced what age and neglect had taken. She thought about her hands, still capable of movement, still carrying all those years of muscle memory. She thought about Vienna, and about Derek, and about the hospital ceiling. She thought about the bus stop on Fifth Avenue in the rain. Marcus moved from his seat beside her, and he did something she had not expected. He knelt down in front of her wheelchair, so that he was below her eye level, looking up at her face, and she understood that the position was deliberate, that he was choosing, in this moment, not to stand above her, to be the one who looked up rather than down. He said quietly, "I know that you have spent a long time inside a story someone else wrote for you. The story where you apologize for taking up space, where you make yourself smaller so that other people don't have to adjust." He stopped for a moment. "I would like, if you'll let me, to spend the rest of my life beside you, not in front of you, not behind you. Beside you." Emily looked at him for a long time. The lantern light caught the wet in her eyes. "That's not a question," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. Marcus smiled. "May I spend the rest of my life beside you?" he said. Emily reached out and put her hand on the side of his face. "Yes," she said. "Yes." The Open Doors Foundation was incorporated 11 months after that evening in the park, with Marcus and Emily as co-founders, and a mission that encompassed 3 interconnected areas of work: funding accessible design in public and commercial buildings, providing arts scholarships for individuals with physical disabilities, and establishing community arts centers built specifically around the needs and contributions of disabled artists and performers. The name had been Emily's idea. Marcus had liked it immediately, not because it was clever, though it was, but because it meant 2 things at once: the physical and the metaphorical, and because he had always believed that the best ideas do. In the first year of operation, the foundation funded accessible renovations at 37 public buildings across the city. It endowed 12 scholarships at the city's conservatory and 2 other music schools. It broke ground on a small performing arts center in the East District, the same district where Marcus had grown up, where the streetlights had worked only half the time, designed entirely around accessibility and built with input from disabled artists at every stage. Emily had been involved in the design process from the beginning, and she had also, quietly and without announcing it, begun practicing piano again. Not performing, practicing, working through the repertoire she had left behind, relearning what her hands remembered and what they had forgotten, discovering what was still there and what had changed. She practiced in the small room at the back of their shared apartment, in the early mornings before Marcus was up, and she did not tell him about it for a while, because she was not sure what she was working toward, and she did not want to call it anything until she knew what it was. She found out what it was on an afternoon in September, when one of the conservatory faculty members, a woman who had heard about Emily from 3 different former students and finally tracked her down through the foundation, called and asked if Emily would consider performing at a benefit concert. The school was organizing for the new scholarship fund. Emily said she would think about it, and she hung up the phone and sat in the quiet apartment for a long time, and then she went to the piano and played through the entire first movement of the Beethoven sonata she had been practicing for 3 months. And when she finished, she sat with her hands in her lap and understood that she was ready. She told Marcus over dinner, between the salad and the main course, in the same kitchen where she had eaten most of her meals for the past 8 months, at the table by the window that looked out over the building's small courtyard, where a single maple tree had spent the fall, losing its leaves, and was now bare and patient against the November sky. He put down his fork. He looked at her with an expression she had come to know well over the year they had been together. The expression that meant he was feeling something more than he was going to say. The expression that appeared when a piece of music surprised him, or when someone said something that opened a new door in a conversation he had thought he understood. "Okay," he said. Emily laughed, a short, slightly disbelieving sound. "That's all? Okay?" Marcus looked at her steadily. He picked his fork back up, What do you want me to say? You've been practicing every morning for 4 months. I've been waiting for you to tell me. Emily stared at him. You knew? He met her eyes without looking away. I live here, he said. She threw her napkin at him, and he caught it without looking, and they were still laughing when the food got cold. And later Emily would think about that moment, the napkin, the laughter, the maple tree outside the window, and understand that this was what home felt like when it was real. The concert was held on a Saturday evening in early December, in the main hall of the conservatory, a room with which Emily had a complicated history, having performed there multiple times in her previous life, in a body that moved differently and a life that looked completely unlike her current one. The hall had been renovated the previous year, partly through foundation funding, and it now had a fully accessible stage entrance and a section of floor-level seating that allowed wheelchair users to sit among the general audience rather than in a designated block at the back. Emily had not specifically requested this arrangement, but she had noted its absence in her original accessibility review, and someone had listened. She performed 2 pieces, the Beethoven she had been practicing, and a short, spare work by a contemporary composer she had encountered through the Foundation's Artists in Residence program. She played the Beethoven from the same place she had always played it, from somewhere deep and considered and precise, and the audience understood almost immediately that this was not a brave performance or a remarkable performance or a performance to be admired for the circumstances of the performer. It was simply a performance, excellent and fully itself, by a musician who had not lost what she was. When she finished, the hall was quiet for a moment, in the way that concert halls go quiet when something real has happened, and then people began to stand, and the applause built and continued, until Emily looked out from the bench and found Marcus in the front row, and he was not clapping. He was just sitting there looking at her with that expression, the one she knew, and she looked back at him, and felt something complete and unhurried settle into place inside her, the way the last note of a well-played piece settles into silence. Afterward, in the green room with a small group of friends and Foundation board members and conservatory faculty, Emily sat beside Marcus and held a glass of sparkling water and felt, for the first time in a very long time, simply happy, not relieved, not grateful in the exhausted way of someone who has survived something, but genuinely, simply happy in the way of someone who is exactly where they want to be. People came to speak to her former professors, a journalist who covered the arts for a local publication, 2 young pianists from the conservatory who were studying on Foundation scholarships and who looked at her with an expression she recognized as the look of people encountering someone whose story has already mattered to them before they met. She spoke to everyone with the same warmth and without the apologetic undertone that had once threaded everything she said to strangers. She accepted compliments without deflecting them into nothing. She told one of the young pianists that her phrasing in the second theme was worth listening to very closely, which was not flattery, but a specific and considered observation, and the young woman's face opened with a kind of joy that Emily found she could receive without immediately minimizing. A woman from the conservatory board said something about the performance being extraordinary and inspirational, and Emily smiled and thanked her and let the word go, because she had learned by now that other people's language for what she was could not diminish what she actually was, and that not every word needed to be corrected, only lived past. She looked at Marcus later, in the car, when the city was streaming past the windows in its nighttime version, all lit glass and wet pavement, and the distant sound of something playing from a bar on a corner somewhere. Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you? She asked. Marcus was watching the road. Yes, he said. She waited. He glanced at her. You said sorry, he said. Emily nodded. I said sorry. She looked out the window for a moment. I think I thought that was the only currency I had, that if I apologized enough, people would let me stay. Marcus said nothing. He reached over and covered her hand with his on the console between them. Emily looked at their hands. I don't say it anymore, she said. Not like that. Not as a way of making myself smaller. She paused. Now I finally know that I never needed to apologize for any of it. Not for my chair. Not for the space I take up. Not for being here. Marcus squeezed her hand. The city moved around them. Somewhere in the distance, the bar on the corner was still playing something, and the rain that had threatened all evening was finally letting go. The last time Marcus pushed Emily's wheelchair truly pushed it, in the sense of doing the work for her rather than the easy, companionable role of two people moving through a space together, was on a path along the reservoir in Central Park on a Sunday afternoon in late October, almost exactly 2 years after the rain-soaked morning on Fifth Avenue. Emily had been trying a new manual chair, a lighter model she was test driving on the recommendation of her physical therapist, and she was tired after a long week of foundation meetings and a recording session for an album she was making with two of the conservatory's younger faculty members, and the path was slightly uphill, and she had said, without any particular emphasis, "I'm going to need some help with this part." Marcus had said, "I know," and fallen into step behind her. He did not make anything of it. There was no performance in the gesture, no tenderness announced or noted. It was simply the thing that needed doing. And he did it, the way he had always done the things that needed doing, without ceremony and without expectation of recognition. The afternoon was warm for October, the kind of afternoon that feels like a gift from a season that knows it is almost over. The light slanted and golden and unhurried, and the surface of the reservoir caught it and scattered it in a way that was almost too beautiful to look at directly. They did not talk for a while. They did not need to. The path curved around the reservoir, and the city rose above the tree line on every side, and a couple walked past with a dog and a small child in a stroller, and nobody looked at anyone in any particular way, and it was just an afternoon in a park, just two people moving through the world at the pace that worked for them, which was the pace of the people they were. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Emily said. Marcus made a sound that meant he was listening. "That bus stop," she said. "The rain. I had missed 2 buses. I was cold and wet, and I was apologizing to nobody in particular, just sort of broadcasting an apology into the air in case anyone around me needed to hear it." She paused, and then you stopped. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You said something that made me stop," he said. "Not the apology. The fact of the apology. The fact that you thought you had to." Emily considered this. The path leveled out, and she took her wheels again, and Marcus walked beside her. "I was trying to be invisible," she said. "I'd gotten very good at it." Marcus nodded. "And instead," he said, "you became the most visible person in my life." Emily looked at him sideways. He was watching the path ahead, and there was something in his expression that was quiet and certain and completely without performance. The same expression she had first seen on a rainy sidewalk and had been trying to find the right word for ever since. She had it now. The word was home. Kindness does not change the world all at once. It does not arrive with announcement or spectacle or the expectation of recognition. It arrives in the smallest possible gestures, a pause, a kneel, a few words spoken at the right level to reach another person's eyes, and it changes one life, and that life changes the lives of every person it touches, and those lives change others still, rippling outward in ways that no single act of kindness can predict or control or fully understand. Marcus Johnson had stopped on a sidewalk in the rain because his mother had given him a rhythm to live by, and that rhythm had told him what to do before his mind had finished processing the question. Emily Carter had let him stop, had let him stay, had let herself be seen, and in being seen had found her way back to everything she thought the accident had taken from her. They had built, together, a foundation that opened doors. They had found, in each other, a home that required no apology. The world did not change all at once, but it changed, and it is still changing, in the particular and irreversible way of all things touched by genuine kindness, moving outward from a rainy street corner into everything that came after.